Hello and welcome again to Why Fight, a conference on politics and ideology in militaries and armed groups, organized by the UCD Centre for War Studies. Our papers in this session will examine how ideologies as sets of vaguely but not necessarily consistent ideas have influenced the behavior of soldiers, officers, and military planners. Our next speaker is Koutoufaris-Malandrinos, a lawyer based in Athens, Greece, and a doctoral candidate in constitutional law at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Jason will offer a sweeping survey of the history of so-called democratic armies in the 20th century. We usually think of the military as the most authoritarian form of organization. 20th century, however, saw multiple attempts to build armies that were ostensibly democratic. What could this possibly mean, and was it ever successful? Jason addresses these questions in his paper.
I am Jason Koutoufaris-Malandrinos, and this talk is about the concept of democratic army throughout the 20th century. One thing is for sure, this concept was hotly debated in that century. People disagreed about what constitutes democracy in army, and many reached the conclusion that there is no such thing. Take, for example, George Smalley, the chief war correspondent for the New York Tribune. Some months before the eruption of World War I, he is quite annoyed because those who wanted the democratization of the British Army seemed to attach no precise meaning to the word democratizing. More recently, during a session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in September 1998, Andreas Gross, a socialist Swiss politician, said in a very straightforward way that, quote, a democratic army is a contradiction in terms, unquote. Certainly not something that one expects from a Swiss and a socialist. But let's not deviate. The debate that was hot at the beginning and the end of that long century continues in modern historiography. For example, Zoltan Barany, in his 2012 book on democratic armies, hastens to point out a terminological caveat, namely that, quote, strictly speaking, democratic army may sound like an oxymoron, since armed forces are inherently hierarchical and non-democratic institutions, unquote. According to him, democratic armies are armies supportive of democratic rule. I think that if we are to discover the concept of democratic army, we must differentiate between concept and conception. This is actually a well-known distinction in legal and political philosophy. We may have many conceptions of what a democratic army should be, but they are all against the background of a less variant and yet more abstract concept. A teleological view of this distinction is more easy to grasp. Conceptions are to a concept what means are to an end. But how many conceptions of the democratic army are there? I think that we could discern two broad categories with several subcategories. The armies that are democratic in essence and the armies which are democratic in function. This terminology is, of course, faute de mieux. An army is democratic in essence if it has a certain quality that justifies this characterization despite its methods of functioning. For instance, the Federal Defense Force of Germany, the Bundeswehr, is democratic because it is an army in a democracy, according to their own motto. Its members are loyal to democratic governance, and its leadership is under civilian control. This is also true for most Western countries these days. Another example is the Zapatista army. It defended the rebel autonomous municipalities in Mexico without having the right to intervene in their governance. Its motto is freedom, democracy, justice. But Subcomandante Marcos was clear that this army is not democratic in its function. And I'm quoting, "We have not deceived anyone from below. We have not hidden the fact that we are an army with its pyramidal structure, its central command, its decision hailing from above to below. We didn't deny what we are in order to ingratiate ourselves with the libertarians or to move with the trends. But anyone can see now whether ours is an army that supplants or imposes." Another example, according to US Lieutenant Colonel Andrew P. Camira Jr., writing in 1978, "Democratic armies are machines of the national purpose sustained by a sympathetic national consensus. This entails, according to this author, that an army is democratic if it perceives itself to be a democratic army and if it reflects a popular consensus of the people, that is, if it is subject to society's veto." Another good example is a story that Lenin was fond of telling. One year after the Bolshevik coup d'etat, he was in a Finnish train when he overheard a conversation between several Finns and an old woman. The woman said, "Now there is no need to fear the man with the gun. I was in the woods one day and I met a man with a gun, and instead of taking the firewood I had collected from me, he added some more." For Lenin, this was the best proof that the army had been democratized and that the man with the gun protected the working people and would be ruthless in suppressing the rule of the exploiters. I could mention many more accounts according to which democracy in army boils down to meritocracy, absence of distinctions based on class, race, religion, etc., for entering the army, or non-professionalism. That is, militia is democratic, but standing army is not. But I think you get the point. On the other hand, an army is democratic in function if it is structured and operated in a democratic manner. This conception of democratic army contains elections of officers by the soldiers, political discussion and/or indoctrination, a general culture of equality, and finally, what Max Weber had called the communistic comradeship of an army. This conception was sometimes a goal to be achieved by decrees. The Red Armies of Russia and China in their early days, of course, come instantly to mind. But there were also de facto situations. A good illustration is here the tribal Arab army during the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. T. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, described this Arab army as a self-governing democracy. He further relates, and I'm quoting, "In this regular Arab army, there was no power of punishment whatever. This vital difference showed itself in all our troops. They had no formality or discipline. There was no subordination. Service was active, attack always imminent, and like the army of Italy, men recognized the duty of defeating the enemy. For the rest, they were not soldiers, but pilgrims, intent always to go the little farther." Unquote. The Republican militias during the Spanish Civil War are another example. George Orwell is most revealing here. I will read a long passage from his book Homage to Catalonia, because I believe that it captures at once many conceptions of what it means for an army to be democratic in function. And I'm quoting, "The essential point of the system was social equality between officers and men. Everyone from general to private drew the same pay, ate the same food, wore the same clothes, and mingled on terms of complete equality. If you wanted to slap the general commanding the division on the back and ask him for a cigarette, you could do so, and no one thought it curious. In theory, at any rate, each militia was a democracy and not a hierarchy. It was understood that orders had to be obeyed, but it was also understood that when you gave an order, you gave it as comrade to comrade and not as superior to inferior. There were officers and NCOs, but there was no military rank in the ordinary sense, no titles, no badges, no heel clicking and saluting. They had attempted to produce within the militias a sort of temporary working model of the classless society. Of course, there was no perfect equality, but there was a nearer approach to it than I had ever seen or than I would have thought conceivable in time of war. Unquote. Of course, we can also find mixed conceptions of democratic army. Captain X is a case in point. This was the pen name of a British soldier who may have been Major William Godolphin Conway Shiber, who died in the Battle for Caen in 1944. Anyway, this soldier published a book under the title A Soldier Looks Ahead. The prerequisites of a democratic army, according to this book, were four: the best possible officers, democratic spirit and education, an efficient channel for suggestions and complaints, and finally, good pay and conditions. In the same vein, 3 years later, the Democratic Army of Greece, namely the communist faction during the Greek Civil War, was seeking to share the power between guerrilla assemblies and Communist Party commissars, and at the same time, it claimed to be the military arm of the people, which fights for the freedom, the independence and integrity of Greece and the democratic liberties of the Greek people. The description of guerrilla warfare by Che Guevara is also important in grasping a conception of democratic army in both essence and function. On the other hand, we could observe sometimes a tension between democracy in essence and democracy in function. For instance, the Bolsheviks followed a functionalist democratization of the army. Soldiers elected their officers, no ranks or titles, no saluting, no insignia. These reforms came under scrutiny in the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention of 1917, and they were criticized from an essentialist perspective. Delegate Bouvet of Hingham stated that no army in the world can be administered as is that of Russia at the present time and be effective, and made the following argument, and I'm quoting: there should be a democratic army. It should be democratic in this way. Every man in this country should have the opportunity to enter the ranks and be the highest officer that the army holds if he deserves it. But that democratic army exists. It exists today. Your army is democratic, democratic in opportunity, but it is not democratic to the extent that politics shall enter into it. Unquote. Two remarks should be made. First, the continued debate between contrasting conceptions of democratic army, as well as very conscious efforts to create such an army or to inject more democracy to existing military institutions, bears witness to a growing democratic consciousness. At the same time, the spread of that democratic consciousness also meant the spread of democratic conscientiousness. In other words, who is more democratic? A typical example here is the Australians boasting during World War I that their army was more democratic and more egalitarian than the British Army in any conceivable way, despite the fact that the differences between the two forces were not so great. Second, we observe a change in perspective. In the 19th century, people were astonished that democracies had defeated monarchies. In the 20th century, They were equally astonished that democracies remained democracies after having defeated autocracies. That's why the American government tried to convince the American people during the Second World War that a democratic country could go to war against a totalitarian state without being itself militarized and de-democratized. Benjamin Alpert has written a very interesting and well-documented paper on this subject in the Journal of American History. The title is "This is the Army Imagining a Democratic Military in World War II." I recommend it. What is more intriguing, however, is the fact that this still ongoing controversy over different conceptions of democratic army may have actually concealed a carelessness about the concept of democratic army, namely achieving the goal of checking arbitrary power in military forces. No institution is democratic per se. The means are good as long as they serve the end. At a certain point, the Red Armies fall back to the traditional military organization, ranks, saluting, etc. Is this enough to call them non-democratic? At another point, civilian control of the army in Western countries was established more securely than in the past. Are we justified in speaking of democratization and resting on our laurels? Maybe yes, maybe no. We have to be vigilant if we want to accurately detect what promotes democracy and what leads to democratic backsliding. In the beginning of the 20th century, people wanted to make the world safe for democracy, Woodrow Wilson's famous phrase. And yet the course of this long century saw sustained massification and centralization, marginalization of independent professionals and cooperatives, and several totalitarian regimes. These are circumstances not at all conducive to safeguarding democracy. There is no doubt that the last century tried to make a democratic army, but perhaps eventually it only managed to fake it. Don't get me wrong here. Faking is important because it showcases the significance of a concept. Consider a similar case. The persons who invoke fake news or alternative facts. They are distorting the truth and yet they disclose the fact that they live in a society where the concept of factuality and information about current events is deeply respected. But is faking enough? My presentation has been so far only a preliminary mapping of mentalities and explanations, and I'm afraid a too general one. But I would like to conclude with something more personal. You see, it is only 7 months since I finished my military service, which is mandatory in my country, Greece. I spent most of my days in an artillery camp near the river Evrus at the Greek-Turkish border. There I met many kinds of people. The potential Eichmann, who believed that his total obedience would be his salvation in time of war. The local farmer, who was enlisted only in order to earn a better income. The second lieutenant, who was mixing arrogance and bravado to make his life meaningful. My commander, a perfectly poised man who was willing to explain and provide us with reasons for any significant duty. And finally, the other soldiers, this unusual fraternal fellowship. I became part of this small nation apart, to quote Tocqueville, in which intelligence is less widespread and habits are cruder than in the large nation. Everything was pushing me to be not a man who works and acts, but an animal who labors and consumes. I understood that in army, this miniature of general society, the greatest virtue is not to be creative, but to be tired. But despite all this, when we were wronged by our superiors, Or when we had to face both a refugee inflow crisis and a global pandemic. In short, when conditions called for it, we were ready to stand our ground and act in concert. Because when soldiers don't forget their plurality and their ability to think, speak, and act, democratic army is realized. Remember to ask why fight, and democracy may stand a chance. Thank you for watching.